All right, hello, and welcome again to our latest installment in this year's lecture and film series focusing on Black Atlantic cinema. Tonight we'll be watching The Terror and the Time by the Victor Jara Collective, a film from Guyana, the kind of, I guess, nation situated to the far north of the South American continent, made from 1979 of a period of intense kind of political, let's say, ruptures in that country, and a film that really kind of, I guess, encapsulates that particular moment. Talking to us today about The Terror and the Time, we have the great pleasure to welcome Iyabo Kwayana to the stage tonight. Iyabo is assistant. Well, let's just say, we like bringing scholars to lecture and film to talk about the films, to introduce us to the films and discuss the films afterwards. But I think it's also a particular thrill when we get also, let's say, the voice of filmmakers to talk to us about films. And we have a rare treat tonight because Iyabo has both the scholar's cap and the filmmaker's cap. She is both assistant professor in the Film and Media Studies Department at Dartmouth University in New Hampshire, having studied fine arts at both UCLA in Los Angeles and Northwestern University. So, she has a university context, but she is also an independent filmmaker and cinematographer in her own right, with a filmmaking technique that really involves a kind of sensorial and immersive techniques. Her filmography includes works such as Macarao from 2015, Practice from 2017, the archival film An Exercise in Transfiguration from 2018, and most recently By Water from 2023, a film that she's actually going to be presenting in Zurich tomorrow. So she'll be catching a train straight from Frankfurt to Zurich to show her own work after tonight presenting the work of others. Before bringing her up to the lectern, though, I want to also say, I won't foreshadow too much, but she has also, let's say, a very deeply personal connection to tonight's film. So I'll let Iyabo say more about that. So please join me in welcoming Iyabo Kwayana to talk to us about The Terror and the Time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I first want to start by thanking the co-curators of the Black Atlantic series, including Didi Chica, Daniel Fairfax, Vincent Hedinger, and Bjorn Schmidt, who helped me. I know he's not part of the curatorial team, but he helped me tremendously today, so I'm very grateful for that. I'm honored and humbled to introduce the film The Terror and the Time, directed by the Victor Jara Collective, and my father's comrade, you all know that word very well, probably, Karl Marx, and my uncle, Rupert Roopnarine. How wonderful that this film is part of the Black Atlantic series. Black Atlantic being a theme that directly connects to my upcoming film, Black Pearl. It is also a real pleasure to be here in Germany. I've never traveled here before. And one bright anecdote that I can offer is that my father recently shared with me was about my grandfather, Bertie King, who was a sugar boiler from Guyana who worked in East Africa for most of his short life. And the story resonates deeply as we discuss The Terror and the Time. Occasionally, my grandfather would return home to Guyana. On one such occasion in 1932, he came back from Portuguese East Africa, now called Mozambique, with a German friend and fellow worker named Merlin. When they arrived to Georgetown, Guyana, Guyana's city capital, the exclusive hotel that they went to refused my grandfather, but admitted Merlin. And in a wonderful act of solidarity between workers and friends, Merlin said, "Where kings stay, I stay." So he refused to stay at the hotel, seeing that it was hostile to my Afro-Guyanese grandfather. So that's really my first introduction to German friendship, spirit of work between friends. And also this theme very much ties into the subject matter of this film, which has to do with working people. The stance that Merlin took on behalf of his Afro-Guyanese workmate strikes a chord which resonates the spirits of humanity and friendship that is possible between workers and friends. The story communicates the feeling of standing up on behalf of a friend and not turning away when the indignities thrust upon him by the outside world are forced upon them. The sentiment very much relates to the type of movement that was happening in Guyana in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a movement that produced poets and artists such as Martin Carter. Carter's work reminds us to hold fast to the concern for justice and human dignity, lest we risk becoming more monstrous than human. So this film was created by the Victor Jara members. And this person here is, oh, I can't see the mouse there, but that's my uncle Rupert Roopnarine, my father's friend, so not an uncle by blood. The second person is Ray Krill. Then we have Susumu Tokunao. And we have here Luann Jones, who's really been the film's pioneer. And I want to share some words from Luann about how this film got started. It's a lengthy clip, but she really deserves a lot of honor for keeping the life of the film. Yeah. Go through some of the imagery, the ephemera of this movement that began in Guyana, not with the film, but with artists and cultural people and multi-racial efforts. So the first slide on the left is sort of a postscript. These two slides, I guess, is a postscript which juxtaposes the imagery from the film with Martin Carter's poetry. The first poem that is represented here is called Cartman of Day Clean. Day Clean meaning dawnbreak. The second image connects imagery from the dwellings of Black working people with the poem I Come from a Nigger Yard, the Nigger Yard. Nigger Yard refers to the place designated for Africans on the plantations. And it's interesting that when Indians came as indentured servants, they were also designated to a place on the plantation. That place was called Bound Yard. So the British really liked to confine people to places and give them terms. So this was the term that marked their indentured status. The third image, I'm not certain what the poem is, but it shows the sky next to the poem, and the poem reflects Carter's interest in the skies, and much of the imagery within his poems intertangles the natural world with the cosmos and nature. So that kind of is a reflection of that. And then the last image here in the center is the image of a child in front of a coker or sluice, which controls the input and output of the water in the canals between the cane fields. So the language within the film is very much tied to the sugar product, right? And also the landscape. And then finally we have over there the poet himself, Martin Carter. And he was a political threat in Guyana at the time, and he was beaten and detained. And that poem is juxtaposed with poetry from letters from prison, poems from prison during his detention period. And then we have, I believe it's in German. I don't know what it says, but I think it's a screening. So the collective traveled very far with this film, and that's my father there, Iyabo Kwayana, then known as Sidney King, and Brian Rodway, who was the artist that created a lot of, not these art pieces, but a lot of the imagery that was confiscated by the police was created by Brian Rodway. Having a little issue with the There we go. And then we have Poems of Resistance by Martin Carter, which are described as poems of resistance and affinity, because there's always this tension between the sublime and the struggle in his work. And it's happening again. And then we have various articles of criticism of the film, including one by my father. Not criticism in a negative context, but words that critique and sort of contextualize the movement that was occurring with this film and what it meant for Guyana, what it meant for the world, and how it situated Guyanese struggle within a world context. So I think I'm gonna just keep going, just showing you. This film was initially, The Terror and the Time was meant to be a triptych, but only the first film was realized with the collective. So Luann Jones created In the Sky's Wild Noise, which was meant to be the sequel, or not the sequel, but the second part of the triptych. And you'll see an excerpt of that soon. So various ephemeral objects from that period. So my childhood, this is the part where I talk about my connection with the film. And it's very emotional because of how much of my film was impacted by the struggle, both directly and indirectly. So my childhood was shaped by the challenging dynamics of Guyanese political landscape, many of which are reflected in the continuum of events depicted in tonight's feature. My father, Sidney King, also known as Iyabo Kwayana later, who changed his name, whom you'll see in the film, is an educator and statesman from Guyana. He's 99 years old now and wished he could be here. He had been active in Guyanese politics in various capacities since his youth, including the period before Guyana gained independence in 1966. My mother, Iyabo Kwayana, was an African-American community organizer and educator for over 50 years and a world bridger through her travels and scholarship. She hailed from the segregated South, and she would tell everyone that every time she met them, I'm from the segregated South, because it too left its mark on her. And she traveled around the world looking for African retentions in the diaspora. Immersed in my parents' lives and their concerns for humanity and justice, I grew up deeply influenced by their work and ideals. Like I assume it was for Carter, creativity became a way for me to make sense of nonsense. Creative expression was a way to expose the conceits of reality and realism, not to accept them passively, but to reveal their fractures and possibilities for restoration. In this way, I deeply connect with Martin Carter, whose poetry illuminates the lives of Guyanese people and captures the spirit of resistance reflected in everyday struggles of the working class people. Actually, we'll call them the working people rather than the class. In 1972, prior to the period of this film, Walter Rodney wrote what would become one of the most recognized books about ways that colonial empires systematically extract from and underdevelop the nations they occupy. that book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, received wide acclaim and challenged the mythology around development and underdevelopment and what that really meant on a practical level regarding the single crop economies that colonial powers depended upon. On one hand, there's single crop economies produced wealth for the colonial powers and poverty for their workers. And you'll see examples of this in the film. Rodney's intellectual analysis was not simply an academic exercise, but was, in a way, a product of the intelligence and testimony of everyday people that lived under the constraints of colonial economies. Although Rodney's work was groundbreaking, there were stirrings of this analysis within the rich Caribbean folk culture of calypso, theater, poetry, and in many ways the colloquialisms that came out of these artistic traditions were just as viable a source of inspiration to the movement as Rodney's work was. In essence, the forms of artistic expression were related to the multifold intelligence of a people. And I'm sure if you know anything about African culture, or this is actually true from every ethnic person in Guyana, every tradition, whether it be Chinese, Indian, Portuguese, African, Amerindian, there's a very deep sense of culture and cultural expression as a way of grappling with life. So the working people and children possessed a sophisticated analysis of the circumstances that they lived inside and possessed ingenuity in disguising their critiques of the powers that be with clever innuendo and euphemisms that hid the true meaning of whether it's poetry or theater. During the decades prior to the end of the British rule in Guyana, there was a stir in the consciousness of the people that attempts to guide them towards their own liberation. In Guyana, this stir became a spark and then grew as people began to see themselves and their struggles in other movements of laborers around the world. Then they took active measures to organize, first through labor movements, then unseen collective forces that tied their struggles to other struggles worldwide would become an anti-colonial movement in the 1950s. There we go. Oh, I'm missing some slides, but that's okay. The terror and the time was set against a backdrop of Guyana during the decades preceding the end of the British rule, a period marked by unrest and the awakening of collective consciousness among the subjugated people. This era saw a burgeoning realization of shared struggles within other global labor movements, igniting a spark that evolved into organized resistance. Initially centered around labor movements, this energy began to expand into broader anti-colonial movement in the 1950s, spreading like wildfire. And John Hess writes of the film, images appear first as simple denotation, a torch to light the way, a clock tower, urban slums, sugarcane fields, but then they accrue connotations with each reappearance until the torch is revolution. The clock tower is time, the slum is Hades, and the cane fields signify the strength of the Guyanese people. He continues, like Martin Carters' poetry, which runs through the film as a sort of narration. The film is composed of loosely connected images, not randomly, with which are both public and private, real and unreal, specific and general. And the power of the whole is to evoke the suffering and the struggle of the people derives from the contradictions and the tensions in these images. This imagery sets the tone for the Guyanese faced. To fully appreciate tonight's feature, we kind of need to understand a little bit of the historical context about the 1950s era in Guyana, and the time in which there was significant tension, including being influenced by the Cold War. Britain, keen to retain its waning power, faced growing resistance from the working class in its economies and its colonies. The unrest was fueled by the global post-war mood as colonial soldiers who fought against fascism in World War II returned home only to face the systematic oppression of colonial rule, an irony not lost to those who battled for freedom abroad. Guyana in those days was called Booker's Guyana, BG, British Guyana, but also Booker's Guyana, named for Booker's brothers McConnell and Company, which was a sugar monopoly that ruled Guyana. In effect, BG managed all the sugar estates, even those they didn't own, and all the exporting and controlling of every associated market and all the monies generated by sugar. Just a note that this conglomerate also controlled taxis, commerce, manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. They spoke of the power of sugar in Guyana, referring to King Sugar, and called the nation Booker's Guyana as the dominant sugar, after the dominant sugar monopoly. However, there was a growing resistance to this monopoly, driven by the harsh living and working conditions faced by the laborers. And this film addresses this pivotal historical moment and the measures colonizers took to maintain power, measures that included armed invasion of Guyana and the suspension of the Constitution to retain control over the market. Local police, under the orders of the magistrates, would also raid the homes of writers and poets to confiscate their works, stifling voices of dissent. And this is where I actually spoke with the son of Martin Carter, Keith Carter. Let's see if I can find him. He is this person here. Oh, standing up behind his mother, Phyllis. And he told me a story about the police coming to raid their home, and they actually hid poems inside the crib mattress because they were ravenous. The police were ravenous at confiscating any writing that countered the colonial narrative. And so this is kind of where we find ourselves. I wanted to also invoke, let's see. So poetic resistance was very important, both in its composition and its ethos, echoing the pressures of the time. Amid these struggles, a new movement of workers began taking shape globally, accompanied by the emergence of a new political force in Guyana, the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, inspired in part by the writings of Karl Marx. The PPP was founded by Chetty Jagan, Forbes Burnham, Iyabo Kwayana, and Rory Westmus. During the colonial era, free speech flourished among the native populations, but this tradition began to erode after World War II with the onset of the Cold War in 1947. Chetty Jagan was elected at the legislature for the Central Demerara in Guyana in the general election, but he quickly became a prominent advocate for the working class people, gaining support and attention, including that from my father, and drawing on Jagan's dedication to the rights of working people and his alignment with a growing international movement against colonization and corporate exploitation, he became a big threat. By 1953, another general election took place where the PPP, led by Jagan and his wife, emerging as a dominant force, took control again of the general electorate. But the PPP's social leanings and perceived pro-Soviet stance alarmed Britain, and Britain justified taking away, using the Monroe Doctrine, which was a doctrine to prevent the Northern Hemisphere for being taken over by Soviet powers. Britain justified taking away the seats that the general public had elected. So this was kind of the source of the problem in the film. So because of this decision on October 53 to dismiss the government elected by the people, they also brought in armed troops, invaded Guyana, and then they subsequently suspended the Constitution. And as resistance began, they also detained Martin Carter, as his words were so powerful that they were dangerous to the empire. So I just want to leave you with a few thoughts about the role of the poet in resistance movements. So many people, including my father, would recite or read Martin Carter's poems at public meetings. Ordinary people would also be very interested in his poetry because the poems were about them. And that is why he was a threat. His lyrics were dangerous, and those that read his poetry did not treat his poetry as academic or confine it to educational institutions, but instead read the poetry publicly and let it resound in the ears of everyday people. And this is how the lyrical prose of the poet became the chief threat of the British Empire. It disrupted the linearity of a system that rationalized their subjugation, principally because the poet spoke to everyday workers and articulated their struggles and humanity. I just want to invoke some of Trinh Minh Ha's, who's a Vietnamese ethnographic filmmaker and scholar, her thinking around the role of poets in resistance movements. She says, the poet, the cultural resonance is the poet is in control of the cultural resonance. Minh Ha emphasizes the movement must sing in the tongue of the people, incorporating their metaphors, idioms, and silences. Without this cultural resonance, movements risk becoming disembodied abstractions rather than transformative forces. The poet as mediator. The poet does not dictate, but mediates, weaving fragments of songs, stories, rituals, and silences into narratives that movements can inhabit. Their voice is many-voiced, resisting the reduction of complexity into slogans. For the PPP to truly become of the people, it must embrace the poet's insistence that liberation is as much spiritual and imaginative as it is material. Resistance is ritual. Movements falter when they lose the rituals that make them living entities. The poet reminds us that resistance must be celebratory and ceremonial, anchoring activism in rituals that sustain its vitality. And also just a cautionary tale by James Baldwin, who also talks about the importance of poets in movements. He says, the poets, by which I mean all artists, in his 1963 speech, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, are the only people who know the truth about us. Soldiers don't, statesmen don't, priests don't, union leaders don't, only poets. And then he says, when a civilization ceases to produce poets or to believe in their reports, it faces a profound crisis. Baldwin reminds us that the poet's testimony, though often unwelcome, bears witness to truths others avoid. Their awareness confronts us with what we know but refuse to face, exposes the discomfort of complicity and denial. This reflection circles back to the work of Martin Carter, whose poetry embodies this very ethos, a relentless bearing witness to the realities of time. So I just want to make brief mention of the poems that you'll see in the film, or you'll hear in the film. The Cartman of Day Clean is about the everyday laborer who toils from dawn to dusk, and the cadence of the poem mirrors the physicality of the labor, grounding the audience in the realities of life on Guyana's sugar estates. The second is I Come from the Nigger Yard, and it's a reclamation of history. This poem transforms a site of subjugation into one of pride and cultural significance. It celebrates the survival and memory of enslaved Africans and their descendants, asserting the dignity. And then On the Fourth Night of a Hunger Strike is a poem in which Carter wrote when he was detained. And one of the ways that they used to resist as well was to stop eating. So this was a way that they threatened the people that would captivate them, is by refusing to eat. And then finally, This is the Dark Time, My Love, is a haunting reflection of a colonial violence. This poem juxtaposed oppressive imagery, boots, blood, and steel, with the quiet defiance of lovers. It captures the enduring spirit of resistance amid the festival of guns and the carnival of misery. And so I just want to play one final clip by Walter Rodney. This is from the second film that will come after Terror and the Time, and I just want you to keep it in your minds as you watch the film. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll watch the film. It's a shortish film, 70 minutes long. So hopefully that gives us also a nice opportunity for a Q&A with Iyabo after the screening. So catch a breather and the film will be starting up in about 10 minutes. Okay, well, we have some time for questions and answers or discussion, commentary. I might kick off with a few questions for Iyabo. One being, I mean, what the film really, I think, gives us is how, I mean, there's this extraordinary, let's say, confluence between this work of this kind of poet, Martin Carter, who's kind of recognized really as the national poet of Guyana, and this kind of political movement, which is rare in history, that we get someone who has seemingly such a standing in the nation as an artist, but also like he's very, very invested in this political struggle and kind of like, and clearly he has a resonance amongst the population.
Yes, a deep resonance. He used to hold meetings and gatherings within his home, and that's where he would recite his poetry first. And so he really was an anchor, a cultural anchor, and Guyana is a very particular place with regard to this type of intellectualism that comes out of folk culture. So when he would hold these events at his home with his wife Phyllis and his children, that's where he would test his ideas. And another thing that made that period so significant was that is how, this is a period that they didn't have radio, they didn't have television, they did have radio, I'm sorry. Radio was the major broadcast system, but they didn't have television, they didn't have phones. And so the way that they would organize was through these groundings. And it was at first a multi-ethnic effort. in the beginning, you see Jagan. My father was a member of every single political party until he was expelled from each of them. But he was willing to work with anyone that was working on behalf of the working people until they didn't. So the way they would organize was going to the workers and having what they would call groundings, where they would speak one-on-one with workers, talking their ideas through with them, and hearing what they had to say. What were their pains? What were their hardships? What were their hopes? What were their dreams? And as I said before, the ingenuity of the folk culture itself was where the intellectual population got their inspiration, as is true in many places in West Africa. It's really a bilateral exchange. So this is the type of space that Carter found himself in, and that is why he was able to really be an anchor for the movement.
His poetry also seems to be very rooted in the kind of lived experience of laborers as well, like what it means to actually work and the kind of exist under these conditions, and the way he's able to kind of transform that into poetry I found really fascinating.
That the poem about the cartman, I think he describes the cartman as an invisible person that is almost cloaked in the invisibility of night. Don't quote me on that, but something to that effect. He looked upon the worker, possibly because of his own background, with a lot of affection and sensitivity. And so this is where that type of sentiment comes in. And I tried to get more information about his own upbringing from his son, Keith Carter, who had a terrible sore throat when we spoke. So instead of asking him question after question, I just ended it with the story of him burying his father burying the poems in his crib mattress.
Yeah. So he's also like very engaged and like directly in the struggle. Martin Carter. Well,
Martin Carter was he served a particular task for the struggle, but children of revolutionaries don't tend to be as engaged because we're traumatized. So his son Keith Carter and the children are normal people that hold the sentiments of their parents dear to their hearts. They understand that it's true, but choose a different type of service to humanity other than the perpetual struggle.
I wonder what is the kind of historical knowledge today of that period in Guyana's history, and also of the work of Martin Carter. I mean, is he still read? Is he still kind of known about? Is this whole kind of period of kind of overthrowing British rule still kind of reference for people in Guyana today?
That is a very good question. As you can hear by my voice, I did not grow up there. So anything that I gather about the contemporary response to that period is just from my imagination. So I want to say that. But my sense is that after Walter Rodney died, before he passed away, or he was assassinated, before he was assassinated, there was some fracturing between that multi-ethnic effort in Guyana between working people, and we began to have different political movements and alternating dictatorships between East Indian dictators, African dictators, all Guyanese, just alternating between the powers that be. So my sense is that Walter Rodney was kind of the last icon, cultural icon. Well, I wouldn't say the last, but he was one of the last big figures, big stars that could sort of mobilize everyone around him in Guyana. So I'm guessing that Carter's poems are not as well received, but well read as they were during that period.
Other questions from, yes, up the back here.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting and screening the phenomenal film. I have two questions. One is about like kind of the intention of the film, because I think you mentioned in the introduction that there was some kind of exile movement, of political movement to Guinea, and that there was like this kind of collective spirit of filmmaking and radicalizing themselves. And I think I saw it as in a tradition of also from like films from Cuba, where it was also as a practice of agitation mostly, and sharing your own political practice with other people. And I was wondering if that was also kind of the aspect of that film, that people tried to rather be part of their community, and less about distributing it as a cinematic experience, but more of a political engagement.
Yes. In fact, Rupert Roopnarine writes about this, about the ethos of the collective, and how they really wanted to counter this commercial film industry practice of the individual author, and kind of decentralize the director, although it is heavily authored. So they didn't achieve everything that they wanted to aspirationally, but it still was a collective movement, but it always needs someone to guide the process. And for this aspect, this one film, Rupert Roopnarine was kind of the person that did that. But yes, in their philosophy, they were attempting to do what poetics do, in terms of disrupting linearity, engaging collectivism, and adding to the resistance through this now visual movement, a liberatory movement of film. And they wanted to make plain things that were denied, and that's the role of a poet. So they, in fact, were doing what poets do. They wanted to show a mirror to society, and juxtapose through like the Eisenstein, juxtapose these two realities or these two narratives with one another to show you, to make a conclusion for yourself, how these two things relate to one another. And I'm making this up, so I'm not a part of the collective. I imagine that is what they're doing. Also, Rupert Roopnarine, he was a literature professor, not a member of the working class, after, getting a lot of acclaim at Cornell University, and having the distinction of having a PhD. He and Walter Rodney, in that respect, were intellectuals, but they had an affection and love for working people and this multi-ethnic movement as well. So being part of this study group of Marx, how do you take theories that were born far away and make them real and tangible? They wanted to demonstrate this through first the folk culture, including the music, which you hear, and then generate more of a poetic resistance through the film and through the solidarity of themselves with the working class. And even though they weren't part of, I guess they don't use the term working class, so I continue to slip and say that. They say working people because it's a wider margin. We all can relate to work and toil, right, in our own respects. So this was a way of allowing the middle class or the intellectuals to also have an affinity towards the least among us, the people that don't have the political power to speak for themselves in the same way that the intellectuals do. So I hope that answers your question. And also, thank you. I wasn't sure how you guys would feel about this film. And so I tried to pack my introduction with like the things that the context that you needed in order to navigate the film. But I'm glad that it spoke to you in some way.
Yeah, the...
Yes, thank you. I'm going to also hazard a question, but first, I think I remember around about the time George Floyd was killed, and this British writer, Afua Hesh, wrote on the Guardian, on the pages of Guardian, that the racism that killed George Floyd was built in Britain. I agreed with the body of the write-up, but I put a little bit of question mark to the title of the article to insist that the racism that killed George Floyd was actually built in the colonies. And I think also, for me also, the relevance of this film today, you know, a little bit of brushing a little bit tangentially with his question about the relevance of the film today, in the sense that, especially also with my work with archive, that the violence, the colonial violence, is not a thing of the past. So it still extends in today also, and films like this also, which espouses beautifully and powerfully. And I would like to show this film, by the way, in Nigeria for the archive, so that the idea of third cinema, you know, which actually is not just intended as political pamphlet, also is actually expressed intended as an alternative form of what cinema could be for third world people, for people who are oppressed, beyond also the commercial aspect of what cinema is. So in that aspect, this film continues to be relevant to me, because the violence which is in this film still exists today, still extends to colonized bodies or ex-colonized bodies wherever they are. Curiously, and yes, these people, they call themselves the Victor Jara Collective. Every September in Nigeria, those of us who has flirted and who still espouses the ideology of Marxism, in marking the overthrow of Allende's government. We also remember also the killing of this artist who gave his name to the collective, Victor Jara. So we always remember the two side by side. And agreed, in spite of the distance which you now have from your country. So could you reference also what it is like right now in September? Do people still also remember? I know Daniel asked something like this just now. So, but also I want to make it a little bit simpler. Do people still remember or still reference the memorial of Victor Jara? Because seeing that Guyana and Chile seem to have a unique experience in the fact that it is one place in which artists, poets, and musicians played quite a significant role. Practically no other revolutionary movement in the world had such experience. But in your country, within this new generation, do people still remember this?
So I would say no. Unfortunately, with the advent of media taking the form that it has taken, there is a lot of distraction, as well as a lack of education amongst Guyanese. Guyana at one point used to have 90% plus literacy rate, even with the working people that you saw. They were extremely educated. That has degraded with our constant fighting for power between the working people, actually, between the two different races that are dominant in Guyana. So one of my aunties, I wanted to mention many people that are part of the struggle in Guyana today. So the Working People's Alliance was a group that formed, a collective group that formed in the 70s with Walter Rodney that was a response, a third party that responded to the PPP and the PNC, which the PPP became the party of Jagan and the PNC became the party of Burnham. And there was a group of women that emerged called Red Thread that decided that they didn't really want to be a part of the Working People's Alliance because they wanted to be the conscience of the Working People's Alliance. They saw that this politics game was a game between men, and they wanted to do other type of work like community building, art, and preserve. Some of that community building included preserving art, crafts in the interior with Amerindian women, going to villages and just grounding with women in the villages. And so, and Dai, who was my aunt, all of these people are my aunts and uncles, but aren't really, you know. But she passed away, but she was one of, like Walter Rodney, important intellectual scholar in Guyana. And her brother, Abyssinian, who was an adopted brother, is an artist that wanted to do something like that, to kind of institute an artistic movement within Guyana. But I don't know how far he's gotten with that. And Guyana now is preoccupied because recently they found oil, so there goes Guyana. No, I don't want to say that. But so now we're preoccupied with fighting amongst ourselves because of oil. So there's just more that needs to be done. In fact, I would love to go back there and do some work there with film. But I also feel like an outsider. So some of that work has to come from those who stayed, you know. So unfortunately, the answer is probably not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the film, I think Didi mentioned third cinema, and it seems very influenced by the ideas of third cinema. Yeah. And also even maybe like certain works of third cinema, like Hour of the Furnaces or 79 Springs by Alvarez, you know, like, not saying much. Okay.
Please.
Yeah. I mean, I saw certain resonances with like the use of this kind of percussive drum on the soundtrack with Hour of the Furnaces, and the kind of use of the intertitles as well. It seems kind of very directly coming from that film in particular, which was extremely, I think, influential all around the world. But it seems to me Guyana occupies this very interesting position that is kind of, I mean, geographically it's part of South America, but culturally it's kind of British, like ex-colony. So it's kind of like somewhat in the Caribbean, somewhat in South America, somewhat in the British influence, somewhat in kind of like a Latin American kind of orbit. Mm-hmm. And that kind of gives it, I think it seems to me it gives these filmmakers kind of access to different political and cultural traditions. And
in fact, we have so many nationalities represented there, and so all of that too brings its own influences with it as well. But yeah, I would agree that Guyana is not claimed by Latin America, even though we are part of Latin America. Mm-hmm. We, like Haiti, I think in terms of like our cultural struggles and being annexed from coalitions are similar to Haiti in that regard. But yes, we're claimed by the Caribbean because of our English, and because I guess the way that colonization happened in Guyana, where the colonizers were very absent, but they had like managers in place. So to some extent, there was a lot of autonomy for the people to start governing themselves, which was very different from in other places in Latin America. So, yeah.
The film seems to also make reference, because this is, it's focused on these events in 1953, this is a moment where, I mean, I think the film mentions the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the coup in Guatemala. I think at the same time there's also a coup in Iran to overthrow the prime minister there. So I mean, there's a lot of, it seems to be this year where there's so much stuff happening on this kind of global level that there's kind of Guyana, that the film is very careful to position the events in Guyana within, that there's this kind of broader global, like, Cold War struggle going on, as well as this kind of anti-colonial movement on a global level. I found that also fascinating. Like, they didn't want to somehow just make it a Guyanan kind of story, but actually embed it in a bigger movement. Yeah,
I agree.
And international, yeah.
And that also was part of Martin Carter's poetry. He was always connecting the working struggler in Guyana with other strugglers all around the world. And I think it wasn't even just a spirit of Pan-Africanism connecting to Africa, but also you heard mention of Malaysia and Vietnam, the Mau Mau, like all of these struggles in which if they're experiencing a similar thing, then you have to ask, like, what is the systematic force that is causing them to experience that thing, right? And that systematic force was colonialism and what it does. And Walter Rodney so beautifully talks about how it underdevelops people through the monocrop economy that extract resources and don't care about the people. They don't care that the people can't live, even though they toil all day from dusk till dawn, you know? So I think that is like a significant part to analyze. There's so much study and analysis of the colonized, but what about that system? What is the nature of the system? Like, how can it cause so much collateral damage, you know, around the world? And then when people try to resist, say that they are the cause, you know, they're the violent ones. No, the system is violent. And they can't help in order to live. They must resist on a level. So that is, I mean, and then one thing that is just so striking to me is just how dangerous poetry and thoughts were. Can you imagine? I really had to ask my father again. They were confiscating people's writing and thoughts. Not only that, artwork. And so they had to become a little bit more covert in their resistance in some ways. And there was a gentleman there that I mentioned, Brian Rodway, who died too early, but he was an artist. He used to make these wonderful batiks. And so, you know, there was all kinds of ways that people resisted that weren't just through rhetoric alone.
Yeah, yeah. Further, yes, right at the back.
Yeah, I just want you to throw some light on. I'm going to go a bit into the culture.
Please do.
Because a lot about politics has been said already. Yeah, poetry and things like that. Knowing that Guyana, for example, has a lot of nationalities within the Indian population, how do you trace or how do you connect? I mean, you're an expert in this. How do you connect culturally the happenings at Guyana at this time, and for example, in India, where you also have an Indian population in Guyana, and also at this time in India too, they were having different kind of uprisings, and so what's the connect with this the culture, the poetry, for example, and how did it affect, you know, how did it go across, you know, these places, and then also try to touch on a place like Suriname, who also had a lot of their own struggles with colonial, the Dutch and all of those guys, and still going back to the culture, how the work of poetry, how strong it is, and how was it not able to bring also the present day French Guyana, that is a department of France today, how, and I'm sure at some point they really wanted to be on their own, how I mean, just, discuss throw light on how this cultural work or poetry was able to get to some places strongly, and the movement, and it wasn't strong in some places, and just give us a wide.
Thank you for your question. I'm not an expert on this film, but I will try to answer your question. Thank you. I would say that each population in Guyana was there for different reasons and for different lengths of time. And so the Black Africans there, they had the longest time to maintain their culture, but they were under the most restrictions because they were slaves. So in the 50s and 60s, there was a resurgence. They had a movement called Askria. I don't know what the acronym means, but I've heard it growing up with my parents, but you can look it up, Askria. And they would have people coming. There was an exchange with a lot of artists in the diaspora, so sort of like a Pan-African exchange. And East Indian people in Guyana, they were able to name their children the names. They could maintain their language because they came as indentured servants. And so they maintained a lot of the literature, a lot of the religious practices, and I imagine some of that came with like poetry, particularly in music like calypso. And then the Chinese is a population in Guyana that is not well represented. Neither are the Amerindians in terms of the zeitgeist. It's I don't know a lot about how they function in Guyana because they are sort of under the radar of this polarized thing between Africans and Indians. And then Suriname, so like all of these areas, they had different strengths. In Guyana, there was a perfect storm because they were doing a lot of traveling to Tanzania and studying Nyere, and they went to Europe, and they were influenced by Cuba, and all of these things kind of made Walter Rodney, made a lot of Jagan. They came to the United States, you know what I mean? Rupert Roopnarayan and Jagan both studied in the United States. So there was sort of an international scope and the spirit of Pan-Africanism amongst the Black people in Guyana that made that cultural tradition be influenced by what was happening here. And what was happening here with civil rights was so radical that it almost inspired Black Africans in Guyana to have that same resistance, that same level of resistance. And initially in the 50s, the same was true for the Indian population. They were all unified. But then power corrupts, you know? So there was a point in which they fractured off. And I think that the Indian population maintained their culture. The Africans, to the most extent, like assimilated. But maybe you'll find some Africans now with that would name their kids African names, because that was a whole part of the movement. But what makes Guyana distinct from Suriname is Suriname was more under the radar, but they maintained the indigenous cultures better, like the language, the folk culture. It was more intact, and I don't know why. This is just, my mother also, she went to Suriname before she went to Guyana to study African retentions there. And the makeup of Suriname, I think, is also very different as well. So I don't know if I answered your questions, but I will say that I grew up hearing Indian music on the radio in Guyana. And it enticed me so much that I ended up studying Indian classical music for a short time. But that's how potent the culture was there. And this was in the late 80s. So there was something different intact with Indian culture because of their indentured servitude rather than the enslavement. They were subjugated for less time. And that doesn't take away from the suffering that they experience. Does that answer at all? So. Okay.
And the British also did something with Indians like that in Uganda. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The British also did something like this also in Uganda when they brought in Indians as indentured servants as a bridge between the blacks and the British people. So I think it follows this line of, like we were discussing, that you go to Ghana, you also meet different tribes. The idea of colonizing people, but also dividing them and putting people together in one place without necessarily turning it into a melting pot. So there is always this ethnic division among people. Wherever you find colonialism in the colonial power in the colonies, you always find this division, which people are not usually totally united, but at the same time they are in the same national geographic area, and at the same time they are still a little bit so united. And at some point it becomes like now the former nationalist spirit international has begun to fracture along ethnic lines. You are this, you are that. So I think, to me, it reeks of colonialism. So which of course still need a little bit of more further conversation as we go. Yeah.
Divide and rule, right? Sorry.
If I could, we'll probably have time for maybe a little bit more discussion. But if I could bring in a new topic that seems to be in the film, like let's say, a critique of media. Very strongly. There's this kind of barrage of media imagery that we get in the film, and I found it very interesting that a big focus of that was, and also in the intertitles they talk about the monopolization of media, the class interests that the mass media serves in Guyana. But I found it interesting that there was such a major focus on these kind of advertisements for kind of cultural commodities, fashion and whatever. And that's kind of like almost the counterpart in the film to these images of labor that we get. So we have this kind of, juxtaposition of this kind of really backbreaking, arduous labor on the one hand, and then this kind of the like appearance of this luxury world of kind of consumer goods that the source of those goods is always concealed by this kind of dominant media system.
I think it draws attention to the fact that media is a form of can be a form of propaganda, because I was trying to figure out, like, why would they take the writing and the poetry? And it's because the narrative that's connected to the writing and the poetry must be so compelling because it's connected to a product. It's connected to a lifestyle that a market. And so I think the critique and the scene that I'm thinking of is How Much Is That Doggy in the Window scene. Yeah. That's a song that we heard all the time. And it's such a delightful song, right? But to juxtapose that myth the colonial lifestyle with the realities that people are living inside of. I think it was a brilliant choice to bring media into the film for that reason, just because the reality is very different than the propaganda. Yeah. And I think that is why the poetry and the writing were so dangerous, because poetry dispels those illusions in the most beautiful ways, subtle ways. It dispels the illusions and reveals reality in a way that an advertisement can't do. And so it was more compelling. It awoken something in the spirits of the people and connected to the everyday people in a way that, was devastating, to the point where they mobilized and had a sugar strike. Can you imagine? These are, it caught fire because of the culture around it. And that culture, again, included at that time included the multi-ethnic struggle. And I think that the reason Guyana is in a problem right now, a devastating problem, is because of divide and rule. Now those collective forces aren't together. So the workers are scrambling over crumbs, rather than a collective force where people understand who what the real issue is, not necessarily who, but what.
Yeah, I think Didi, you wanna jump in?
I don't know if it's really a question, and if it's a question, whether it's for you or whether it's for so because regarding your observation, do you think also perhaps because the period was also a powerful period of censorship with the media, also it seemed to coincide with McCarthyism. So the idea of policing artists who could no longer work in the US, and I think Atomila also wrote the book as well as the Crucible. So do you think also your observation you raised, maybe the media, the constant reference to the media, also it has to do also, maybe it also refer to the powerful role which the media played in the terms of the McCarthy witch hunt, looking for communists hiding everywhere, hiding even under people's bed in America. So.
Yeah. No, I thought it was really interesting, if I may answer that, that we have this kind of a whipping up in the media and the newspapers of this kind of anti-communist agitation to kind of almost kind of get people into a frenzy of the PPP is going to make Guyana communist, going to, send the country into the arms of Moscow and so on and so forth. And I think we're probably all familiar with the same kind of agitations we've seen, in recent years. But there's this kind of juxtaposition of that on the same page of the newspaper. There's that, and then some bikini model, showing off, and it's this weird. It's kind of the newspaper is already creating its own critique almost. You could say. But then it's extra perverse in a context of a country like Guyana, where presumably this kind of luxury consumer lifestyle is only available to a tiny, colonial elite fraction of the population. Whereas the vast majority of people, they're not buying any of these consumer products because they don't have the purchasing power to do so. Which I think this answers your question of what makes the poetry so dangerous, is because it can speak to this kind of direct lived experience of the vast majority of the population, and kind of pierce the illusory veil produced by these kind of newspapers that are on the one hand kind of engaged in propaganda, and on the other hand kind of producing this this illusory luxury world that actually has no connection to people's lived experience. So yeah, that would be my response to Didi's kind of prompting. But but you can say something as well. Oh, there's another question?
Yeah.
Okay, up to back.
I'm sorry. Very fast, direct question. I remember in the opening credits, there was music by Yoruba group, something like that. Great music from the film, and I am Yoruba. And I know that Yoruba people are also maybe the largest group out of Africa that was taken as slaves, or that is in diaspora. So please, can you, I don't know, about that music group?
Yeah,
Yoruba music.
Yoruba singers. So I wanted to know, what does this song mean? Because if you listen to the lyrics, it says KKK. Well, actually, I'm not going to try to sing it. But they say, Sama say you kill a Kuliman, and that is referring to an Indian person. So what wrong, Kuli, what wrong? So they're speaking about some violence that was happening between East Indians and Africans. And I don't know, no one can tell me about the relevance of that particular song. But the use of music in the film, I think, in the way that jazz for African Americans is significant, and it has its own structure and its own rhythm and it conjures a certain feeling for African Americans. That music does the same thing in Guyana, and same with the flute music. So the Yoruba singers were probably, maybe they didn't know if they were Yoruba or not, but that was something that was a resurgence during the 60s, when people were trying to connect with their roots. And so my parents, for example, were married in a Yoruba ceremony. My older, but I mean, they were not practicing Yoruba people, but they gave my brother a Yoruba name. They gave me a Yoruba name, So that was just part of this resurgence of embracing African culture that happened during that time.
Any last questions?
Curious about the people that are hiding in the back, but what your thoughts were.
If not, maybe we'll call it a night. I mean, if you want to come up and talk one-on-one with the other. I don't know. It's late, whatever. But thank you once again for an amazing lecture and really interesting Q&A. I think this is a really eye-opening film for me, hopefully for you guys as well. So one last round of applause for Iyabo.
Thank you all.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time for our last lecture and film session before Christmas. So we have a Christmas treat with Mandabi by Ousmane Sembene, which will be presented by me. So see you in a couple of weeks.
That's going to be amazing.
You should all come along.